Today we're going to undertake a bold task, which is to delineate the sequence by which one can recover from a traumatic experience. Recovering from trauma is a bit like surviving a zombie apocalypse, okay? You're attacked by infected artifacts of your past experience, but the world still kind of looks the same. Previously neutral relationships are polarized into allies and enemies, and skeletons from your past linger behind doors in your consciousness, scratching at you. Judgment, addiction, regret, anxiety, resentment, compulsion, numbness, scratch, scratch, scratch. But more to the point, and very much like a zombie apocalypse, you have to follow a certain protocol in order to survive and overcome a wound. For example, your therapist would be the last person you should consult in the middle of a zombie apocalypse. They're dead. Of all the people who would survive in a zombie apocalypse and all the people who would die, therapists would for sure be one of the first classes of people to die, I think, right? Because their competencies don't translate straightforwardly or obviously to survival. How do zombies make you feel? I want you to write a letter to your inner self before the zombies. When a zombie is banging on your glass window, I want you to practice these mindfulness techniques. The point isn't to hate the zombies, but to accept them for who they are. That's the kind of stuff a therapist would say in the middle of a zombie apocalypse, right? And it'd be stupid. You wouldn't go to a therapist because that's the kind of stuff they'd say. You would go to the closest sharp object or gun, and then you would build a cohort with as many people as you trust and get as many guns as you can, as much food and clean water as you can, and you go from there, right? So in a zombie crisis, you would instinctively address your physical needs first, then your social needs. Once all those realities have been secured, well, then you'd make bonds with people, and you'd grieve your loved ones who were killed by the zombies. And you'd build a new society with values, and you would seek to actualize yourself within that society once the overall cosmic threat has been neutralized and the zombies have been cured or killed. My point with this analogy is just to say that talk therapy wouldn't be your first line of defense against a real crisis. So why would it be your first line of defense against a post-traumatic stress? And I know that the answer here is that, well, zombie apocalypse is a physical threat, and so we have physical solutions, whereas a post-traumatic experience is an emotional threat, so we need something more of a psychological solution. I get that, but just entertain my analogy for a second, okay? Would you consider the notion that other helpers besides psychological therapists might be more suited to help you recover from trauma? Because here, I want to sort of examine why cognitive therapy, helpful as it is for sure, isn't as effective as it's made out to be as a holistic program for traumatic recovery. And then what are some better places to begin trauma recovery? And first, I want to sort of highlight the fact that therapy as a whole, I think, is overrated, and the cultural myth that anybody who faces psychological problems ought to see a therapist is not really rooted even in the psychological data. So for some reason, if you have experienced trauma or you're experiencing a difficult time emotionally or psychologically, the most popular response by friends and family and loved ones and society as a whole to those problems is this: you should see a therapist. Am I wrong? Hey, I'm having these problems. I'm having these troubles. I don't know really how to deal with life, right? See a therapist. Hey, this terrible thing happened to me. What should I do? See a therapist, right? It's kind of a blanket, empty advice to say, hey, see a professional. But there's really almost no evidence to warrant that recommendation. So, for example, especially with regard to people who are diagnosed PTSD or suffering trauma. So there was a study which was conducted which demonstrated that at an 87% rate of full recovery among women diagnosed PTSD who completed cognitive behavioral therapy. Now, that's actually pretty good. You might even be thinking, isn't that kind of evidence against your position, Paul? But we should note two things about studies like this, okay? And this kind of highlights what I call not so much the failure of therapy, but the silent failure of therapy, okay? two things about studies like this. First, patients for these studies are pre-selected for these clinical trials who are likely to validate the hypothesis. Okay? Second, patients who drop out of therapy in this study are usually not included in these numbers. So of the patients who finished therapy, 13% did not recover, or 87% did. Okay? That is a bogus pre-selection. Okay? That very significantly skews the numbers. Therefore, these studies which prove the effectiveness of therapy for PTSD demonstrate it only for the sorts of patients whose trauma is mild enough to consistently complete 12-hour-long sessions consecutively. Most psychological studies that investigate therapy inflate the success rate by choosing the patients who are most likely not to drop out. So psychologists often pre-select clients who have a solid track record of attending therapy and regard these sort of unstable clients as unsuitable for inclusion in the numbers, right? Because they don't know how to study them, because they don't know if they're going to show up, which makes sense for a study, but it doesn't make sense when you're talking about the study producing prescriptive methods by which to treat the very thing that's keeping people from coming to therapy consistently, right? So this makes the dropout rate for therapy, according to these studies, seem much lower than it actually is, and also fabricates a perception of effectiveness for methods like cognitive therapy and behavioral therapy. And more than that, researchers usually recognize that the real world dropout rate is significantly higher than the rate of these clinical studies, okay? And this might be due to the failure to build a meaningful therapeutic alliance between the therapist and the counselee, the cost of therapy, the efficacy of a treatment or a therapeutic modality, disagreement between the therapist and the client about what the needs to be accomplished in the therapy, right? All these things can contribute to dropout. But the truth is that the traumatized are twice as likely to drop out of therapy as the non-traumatized, okay? Among one veteran sample, 79% of PTSD cases dropped out of treatment, compared with 50% of anxiety cases and 57% of non-PTSD cases. Another study, which is actually not a study, but a meta-analysis, showed that PTSD could be non-responsive to cognitive behavioral therapy at rates of 50%, 50. Okay? Another study found that PTSD cases had a 78% therapy dropout rate. One study of 2,000 veterans diagnosed with PTSD who were referred to a cognitive behavioral therapist. Of those, 98% had dropped out of therapy by the 5th session of the study against the therapist's recommendation. I recently interviewed a therapist for an article, actually, in the Philadelphia suburbs who has an 80% retention rate, which is a very high in the profession, okay? And I asked him why his retention rate was so high. And he told me this. He said it was two factors, okay? First, he said, my clients have very middle-class traumas. And that was the term that he used, okay? He said that there was a sense in which there is no natural end to the therapy that they were in because there was really no particular threatening symptom to overcome. Okay, so they were kind of stuck in this depth therapy mode where they're just processing their childhood for the next 10, 15 years of their lives with this guy, okay? So that was the first reason. The second was, he said, my clients, I tend to retain them because they are fairly wealthy. Okay, so they can afford to treat therapy as an indulgence rather than as a necessity. So one study that was conducted comments that the dropout of these studies by these clients plagues virtually every treatment trial, leading to average recovery rates in intent to treat analyses of only around 40%. So that original 87% number of women who recovered doing recovered from PTSD diagnosis doing cognitive therapy, one study showed that number is actually probably more around 40%. Okay, so let's put this in perspective. Would you take a car to a mechanic whose customers 50 to 70% of the time do not return for a second visit? Would you buy a gun for self-defense that jammed on the second bullet 50 to 70% of the time? If not, why would you go to a talk therapist to recover from trauma? And the reason is this. There is a cultural myth that counselors are experts in trauma. Well, where else are you going to go? Okay? People usually go to therapy because they don't know what else to do. That's literally why they go. And I'm sort of proposing a little bit of a different starting point. Okay? And my starting point is actually not that profound, and you've probably heard of it before. It's called Maslow's hierarchy of needs, or Maslow's hierarchy of self-actualization, more appropriately termed. Okay, so what I like about Maslow's hierarchy, which I'm going to get to in a second, is that it actually speaks about the nature of the human being. Okay, it actually makes a universal anthropological claim about how human beings work. And to begin with a starting point for an effective therapy, I believe that you have to have an agreed upon conception, at least between the therapist and a client, about how human beings work. And too often, strategic-oriented or modality-oriented therapies don't spend enough time saying, hey, this is how you work. And unless you have that common ground on which to build, a lot of the tactics that therapists will suggest to clients are often superficial, despite their existential depth in the midst of the therapeutic session. So anyway, that was a bit of a tangent. But traditional therapy models try to help counselees to think their way out of post-traumatic stress. Okay? And recovery from trauma certainly does require mental effort. But once you know how trauma recovery should work, you'll see that really which we're going to get to in a second, you'll see that they're trying to get people to go through the right process, but they're doing it back asswards. Okay? So let me explain. All right. There's a psychologist named Abraham Maslow, with whom most of you are probably familiar, okay? And he proposed a theory about how human psychology works. He proposed that human beings have certain needs, and that those needs have to be met in a certain sequence. That is, following a certain order, okay? And just like building a house, if you don't lay the foundation, the rest of the structure will be compromised. So Maslow suggested that the structure of human psychology was made up of 5 needs, one building on the other, like a house, okay? And those needs were met in this order, beginning with the foundation, or beginning with the most fundamental, okay? First was physical needs, like food and shelter, okay? Second was security, like financial security, personal security, kind of basic health, stuff like that, okay? So you got physical needs, security. The third was social acceptance, friends, family, communal belonging, things like that. The fourth was esteem, okay? So we're talking about respect, confidence, recognition in the community, okay? So you've got these 4 so far: physical, security, social acceptance, esteem, and that not just acceptance, but somehow, moving from 3 to 4, ascending the dominance hierarchy of the society in which you're accepted, right? So physical security, social acceptance, esteem, and then the 5th is self-actualization, which is coming to one's own sense of ideals and purpose and peace and equanimity. And so those 5 are physical security, social acceptance, esteem, and self-actualization, okay? And for Maslow, you couldn't meet the security needs without meeting the physical needs first, okay? Building your financial portfolio doesn't make sense if you don't have access to food and shelter, all right? Building up a big bank statement doesn't make sense if you don't have an address that the bank can send a statement to, okay? Working on your esteem by updating your Instagram account doesn't make sense if you don't really have any friends or family. And how many people freaking do this? So in the same way, Maslow will suggest, it doesn't make sense to tinker around in your self-actualization by going to therapy, which is what counseling is, if you don't have your basic physical and safety and social and public recognitional needs met. So, which is actually where most of the problems that people experience occur, and actually where most of the traumas that people experience occur. So for Maslow, this hierarchy is the ideal sequence in which one should meet one's needs. Okay, so we can use this hierarchy as a model for trauma recovery. And this same sequence can translate into the order in which you should address post-traumatic recovery. Okay? So Maslow's hierarchy has been seen by psychologists as a means of self-actualization. which is in a sense true, but as a term, seeing Maslow's hierarchy as a means of self-actualization is actually a misinterpretation of the model. It doesn't really see the big picture of what Maslow was intending to do. This hierarchy does not privilege self-actualization. So calling it the hierarchy of self-actualization, or Maslow's, pyramid of self-actualization, well, just because self-actualization is on the top, that doesn't mean it's the most important. It just means it comes last, okay? So this hierarchy doesn't privilege self-actualization, but quite the opposite. It insists upon putting self-actualization off to the very end and actually privileges the physical. Having one's basic physical and social and relational needs met first is fundamental to the model, and thereby fundamental to human psychology. When a lower level is compromised, then the higher levels which it supports become equally compromised. So if we're going to translate Maslow's hierarchy into something actionable for recovery, then we need an action-oriented lens. And that lens is competence. The lens through which to what do these domains represent for Maslow? They represent competence. That is the action on which each of these domains terminate. The physical, the security, the communal, the recognitional, and the self-actualization all terminate as a skill. The question at the heart of trauma recovery is this: what competence would enable me to process and overcome my undesirable post-traumatic experiences? And if we use Maslow's hierarchy as a model, then the answer is fivefold, okay? Following Maslow's hierarchy, okay? Trauma recovery means becoming 1, competent at physicality, weightlifting, clean environment in your room, clean your personal hygiene, competent at physicality, okay? Number 2, confident in personal security. You have a steady pay and you know how to defend yourself physically. Number 3, competent with intimacy. You know how to build good boundaries. You know how to talk to other people. You know how to meet other people's needs without sacrificing yourself. You know how to prevent yourself from becoming codependent and isolated. Okay? You know how to distance yourself from toxic people and to pursue relationships with healthy people. You know how to learn how to trust trustworthy people and to distrust distrustworthy people. Okay? So competent with intimacy. So you're competent at physicality, competent in personal security, competent with intimacy. You're competent at respect, which means you're competent at giving respect where it's due. You're not disrespectful, right? You require respect where it's due, okay? It means you're not dependent on other people's opinions. You have a level of security because you have respect for yourself, okay? You're competent at respect and that you cherish the respect of others. It means something to you. You don't take it for granted. You're competent at respect in that you can take to heart the criticism of friends without taking that as a sign of disrespect. You're able to nuance the arrows from a friend which are out of love, right? And then finally, you're competent in self-actualization, right? Which means that you can understand your emotions. You know how to process your past trauma. You know how to regulate your emotions. You know how to make sense of your own personal story, sense of the ideals that you want to pursue that govern your life, that give you purpose, determining your ultimate values. And that creates a pyramid, okay? And what particular competencies each survivor needs to build will be different. So for example, if you're a trauma survivor who has powerlifted for years, perhaps you need to learn, if you're going to ascend that pyramid of competencies from physical to security to intimacy to respect to self-actualization, right? Let's say you're a trauma survivor, but you powerlifted for a bunch of years. Maybe you don't need to learn how to become stronger as a way to begin building your hierarchy of competencies in order to meaningfully pursue self-actualization. But what you need to learn how to do is to be more competent, for example, at personal hygiene or cleaning your space and cleaning your room so you're not always sitting in clutter and filth. Or maybe you need to learn how to maintain a clean and orderly car or an environment or an office. You need to make your space one which exhibits competence. And there are base level domains which we often neglect, and many trauma survivors often neglect. Okay? So moving on to that second tier, if you're already, for example, moving on to security, if you're already financially secure and you're a trauma survivor, right, and you sense a level of insecurity and that is really your struggle, you're not going to solve that by self-actualizing and thinking about your insecurity and trying to sort of existentialize your way out of that feeling of insecurity, right? Let's say you don't feel physically safe. Take a jiu-jitsu class. Okay? You're financially secure. Okay? But you still feel that insecurity. Yeah, take a jiu-jitsu class. It's great. You're going to learn how to submit other people. You're going to learn how to be submitted by other people, right? You're going to learn the normalcy of give and take, and you're also going to learn a physical competence that translates into a sense of security. If you're already getting good at sort of cutting toxic people out of your life, perhaps what you need to do is learn the competency of trusting others. So no matter where you're at as a trauma survivor, before you get to that whole therapist's specialty, where they begin digging around in the box of your emotions, there are other base competencies which will have a greater therapeutic payoff for the trauma survivor. So, for example, one study treated homeless people, contrasted those in helping homeless people. There were two groups, okay, and it contrasted those homeless people who received help, who received housing first. That was the first thing they received, and then they received therapy later. And then there were those who received therapy first, and then they received housing later. And at 12 months, nearly half of the homeless people who were enrolled in therapy dropped out of the program. Whereas those who received housing had an active strategy for improving their lives, such as attending school, reuniting with estranged children, investing in real estate. Seriously. Stark difference. Those who met their base physical competencies first, and those who tried to start at the top and start with therapy first and start doing self-actualization exercises before they had a basic physical address. You have to meet the physical needs first. Another study shows that therapists who treat anxiety about medical issues as cognitive behavioral problems only do more harm than good. They ignore the clear physical need at the heart of the issue. They actually perpetuate mental disorder and anxiety, and actually many of those who try to treat these medical illnesses with cognitive behavioral therapy end up dying earlier. And the important thing is to follow the sequence in order. And the reason it's important to follow this sequence in a fundamental tier of the hierarchy, well, because basically is this, that if you have an incompetence lower in a more fundamental position in the hierarchy, it will compromise your performance at higher levels. So if you don't exercise and if you don't eat healthy, you shouldn't think that your depression is caused by a serotonin imbalance. You do not have the credibility to tell yourself that yet, right? If you don't know how to give and receive in a social ecosystem of friendship or family, you shouldn't be confused why you're not respected at work. It's probably because you lack basic relational competencies that you need to learn. Start from the bottom, okay? Work your way up, right? In a recent book by a psychologist, Jordan Peterson, 12 Rules for Life. Rule number 1, stand up straight with your shoulders back. Recovering from trauma means starting with the physical and moving up to the existential, which is a competency approach, not the other way around, which is typical therapy, okay? The problem with most trauma therapy is that it starts with the top of the hierarchy rather than the bottom. Okay? It treats trauma recovery as though it were an existential boo-boo rather than a profound rupture of the self with a fault line that reaches all the way down to one's basic physical constitution, which is where we should be starting. And again, when applied to trauma, don't think of Maslow's model fundamentally as a hierarchy of needs, but as a hierarchy of competence. Okay? Applied to trauma, recovery. One can properly recover oneself that was lost by rebuilding competencies in Maslow's sequence, beginning with the physical and extending only later to the existential. So don't buy the cultural myth that you can recover from trauma by tinkering around in talk therapy. You can get valuable tools from there, but they need to be built on other competencies, and they're going to pretend that they're not. A talk therapist will pretend with you that you can accomplish so much in talk therapy without doing anything in the other 4 domains that Maslow mentions. And if you need professional help pursuing physical competence, there are a ton of resources that you can get, okay? So if you need to build physical strength, you should get a physical trainer at a gym. Or you could buy Mark Ripeto's book, Starting Strength, okay? if you want help decluttering your space and creating a healthy and ordered physical space, you can get a professional organizer to help you learn how to organize your life, and I will actually come to your house and help you organize it. Maybe you just need to get a maid and spend $200, and then your house is going to be clean. All the mess is going to be gone. You can start from scratch. You can go from there. Maybe that's what you need. Or for $10, you can buy Marie Kondo's book, Spark Joy, right? Which actually teaches you how to do it yourself. That book was life-changing for me, okay? Or if your diet's not straight, you can get a nutritionist to teach you how to manage your diet. Or you can buy Mike Matthews' book, Bigger, Leaner, Stronger instead, okay? If you feel insecure about your ability to defend yourself and insecure in your body and you constantly feel unsafe, I highly recommend getting a private jiu-jitsu instructor, okay? I would recommend, especially if you're a beginner, against going to a class and getting a private jiu-jitsu instructor, okay? I tried a class once and I hated it. You might love it, but I hated it. I didn't like jiu-jitsu until I could work one-on-one with an instructor. And I felt far more productive in my trauma recovery after jiu-jitsu than I did after a therapy session, okay? And then eventually I could move into working with a class. Maybe your finances are a total mess and you don't know what to do and you don't know where to start. You can get a financial coach. You can get a financial planner for fairly cheap. Okay. I know it sounds weird. You spend money to learn how to save money, but it is worth it because you will learn competencies that will save you millions of dollars down the road. Okay. Or you could get Dave Ramsey's book, Complete Money Makeover. Okay. There's a book for all of the competencies. If you're saying, no, it's too expensive, I don't have that extra couple $100, buy the book. Buy the freaking book. Trust me, I spent years not doing anything, not buying the book, telling myself excuses for not changing my life. You just buy the book and you do it. I know so many people who've changed their lives with just a book. Okay? Maybe the problem's with marriage. So go to a marriage counselor. I know it costs hundreds of dollars, right? Buy John Gottman's book, 7 Principles of Marriage. Life changer. Life changer. If you're self-motivated and you can do it, trust me, these principles will change the way that you experience these phenomena that feel like a mess. And the point here isn't really to bash therapy, okay? The point here isn't to say that therapists are never helpful. Therapists are helpful sometimes, but their work and their competence must be put in its place, okay? Therapy is garnish that we use to give order and coherence to work we've already done. Okay, one of the reasons the dropout rates for therapy are, between 50 and 70%, up to 98% among veterans in one study, especially among those who diagnose PTSD, are because you're not really addressing the issues that really need to be addressed. Okay, you don't need to talk for an hour a week about the traumatic event or your feelings, okay? That can be helpful. Therapeutic tools can be helpful, absolutely. But what you really need is to have particular competencies that you're working toward for which you can quantitatively track your progress and consider strategies for improvement. Otherwise, therapy is just an attempt to get an emotional payoff for work you're not doing. So look at that sequence that we just talked about, okay? Ask yourself honestly, what incompetencies are sabotaging my life? And how are they sticking points for my post-traumatic stress? Then address those competencies in sequence by establishing habits that sustain the meeting of those needs. Don't put your hope for recovery in a talk therapist. Do not do it. Let talk therapy be one tactic you use to succeed in your broader strategy to cultivate key trauma-related competencies that are unique to your situation and your shortcomings and your weaknesses and your goals. Start there. Start from the bottom. Do not start at the top. Do not start asking a therapist what to do. Start asking yourself, what do I need to do? Start asking a friend. Start taking a diagnostic analysis of your life and your weaknesses and the goals that you have for yourself related to this particular Maslowian hierarchy of competencies. And begin there. Begin as low as you can. Begin as physical as you can and work up from there.